Once again, Shabbat Shalom. What appears in the opening verses of this week's parasha, Chayei Sarah, that Cantor chanted and translated so expertly, to describe a routine kind of real estate transaction, turns out, in fact, to be a statement of deep significance for us and for our connection to Eretz Yisrael, our biblical homeland. The passage, as you've heard, concerns Abraham, who, having just become a widower at the ripe old age of 137, with the death of his wife Sarah, not far behind, as you heard, at 127, must now negotiate the purchase of a suitable burial plot from the local landowners, a people known as the Hittites, who trace their origins to what today is Turkey. By the earliest period of Israelite history, and we're talking about 3,500 years ago, give or take, the Hittites had already become a dominant Near Eastern civilization, ruling over large swaths of territory in today's Middle East, including Canaan, or what we think of as Eretz Yisrael, the biblical land of Israel. The passage describes a detailed negotiation between the bereaved Abraham and a man named Ephron, son of Zohar, the designated representative of the Hittites. After exchanging formalities and explaining Abraham's unfortunate circumstances, extensive bargaining ensues around the terms under which a burial plot may be purchased. The language, some of which you heard tonight, in the negotiation is polite, even obsequious, filled with formal entreaties and honorific titles. Abraham begins modestly, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. I am, as Cantor translated, a resident alien among you, or just as literally, a stranger and a sojourner among you. There's no mention of his wealth, his storied exploits, his divine election, or his and Sarah's status as patriarch and matriarch of a fledgling nation. For the purpose of buying this land, Abraham is just a stranger and sojourner. The Hittites reply, "Hear us, my Lord, you are the elect of God among us." And from there, a negotiation proceeds like a ritualistic dance, right down to the way Abraham bows before the landowning citizens of the Hittite nation. And when they finally agree upon a figure, the price is steep and each shekel is carefully counted. After 20 verses, the entire 23rd chapter of the book of Genesis, the episode concludes on a kind of perfunctory note, with Abraham officially acquiring the cave of Machpelah in what is today the West Bank city of Hebron as a permanent burial site for Sarah, and later it will be for Abraham himself and for their posterity. It is to this day a sacred site of pilgrimage for religious Jews and also a frequent hotbed of unrest between Palestinians and Haredi Jews who reside in Hebron. This kind of elaborate negotiation may in fact be familiar to any of you who have ever bought anything in the bustling shuks and bazaars of the Middle East. My friend and teacher, Rabbi Les Gutterman, once shared a story originally told by Rabbi Mordechai Waxman of blessed memory, a rabbi from Great Neck, who had visited Athens and was invited out to dinner. On the way, Waxman saw a vendor selling flowers, and so he stopped to buy some for his dinner hosts. He asked how much the flowers were, and the vendor said, 26 drachmas. Waxman started to reach into his pocket and take out the money when the vendor said, No, you don't understand how it's done. I'm supposed to say 26 drachmas, and you are supposed to say, no way. The most that I will give you for these poor flowers is 5 drachmas. And then I'm supposed to say, you are taking bread away from my children, but I will come down to 23 drachmas. And then you're supposed to say, no way. The most that I will ever give you for such poor half-wilted flowers is 10 drachmas. And then I'm supposed to say, you are a merciless negotiator, and these flowers really cost me much, much more than this, but I will give them to you for 18 drachmas. And so we are supposed to go back and forth until we finally agree upon 13 drachmas. Rabbi Waxman said that he stood corrected and started to pay the 13 drachmas. The man said, "No, thank you. From my students, I don't take money." And he gave him the flowers for free. So back to Abraham and the delicate matter of buying a burial plot. Why such painstaking detail? Why such length? Why such formality? Does this passage exist merely to convey helpful tips for the next time we find ourselves bargaining in the Middle East? Are we, like Rabbi Waxman, just hapless students in the marketplace of life, with Torah, a humble guidebook, filled with practical wisdom for the naive traveler? Or is there more to it? This evening, I'd like to offer a couple of takeaways from this passage which illuminate its importance. First, in Jewish history, and second, in the Jewish psyche. The first takeaway comes from Avraham ibn Ezra, the great 12th century Spanish sage. He said that the thrust of this passage is to make known the special status of Eretz Yisrael, which surpasses all other lands, both for the living and the dead, as well as to fulfill God's promise of a permanent inheritance for Abraham and his posterity. Ibn Ezra speaks to the centrality of Eretz Yisrael in Jewish life, in Jewish history, and in Jewish memory. A statement made all the more powerful and ironic, given that Ibn Ezra, like generations of Jews before and after him, lived and worked exclusively in the diaspora. But even in Jewish dispersion, perhaps all the more so in Jewish dispersion, Israel has played a central role in our spiritual lives, both, as Ibn Ezra himself notes, for the living and for the dead. Even nowadays, Jews around the world make plans to be buried in Israel. Here at WRT, we have over the years assisted a number of congregants with this request for their loved ones. In fact, one estimate has it that over 60% of El Al planes are carrying a dead body to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. In fact, an article published just a little over 2 weeks ago in the New York Times highlighted 7 Jewish New Yorkers whose lifelong desires were finally being fulfilled. They were in 7 coffins in the cargo hold of an El Al flight to Israel where they would be buried. Some Jews cling to an old belief that the soil of Eretz Yisrael absolves one of earthly sin, which is why even here, outside Israel, many of us are buried with a satchel of soil from the Holy Land in the casket or sprinkled into the grave. Others simply view burial in Eretz Yisrael as the final homecoming, because that is what Israel is for the Jew. Home. Even for those of us who have never lived there, even if we've never even visited. Today, our home is under siege, and not just from Hamas. Even after 75 years of internationally recognized statehood, Israel's legitimacy is being challenged like never before. I, like you, am sick and tired of inflammatory and derogatory claims hurled by anti-Israel activists in the public square, on our college campuses, on social media, all part of a concerted effort to delegitimize the legitimate homeland of the Jewish people. Words like settler colonialism, in particular, get under my skin. Settler colonialism is a smear intended to depict Israel as a society illegitimately established by European imperialists seeking to displace or dominate an indigenous population, when in actuality, Zionism began as an anti-colonialist liberation movement seeking to bring a displaced indigenous population back home after 2,000 years of forced exile. In fact, in Israel's pre-state years, Jewish patrons like Baron Edmund Rothschild, emulating Abraham in our Parsha, purchased land in Eretz Yisrael directly from the Ottoman Empire, well, that is, before the Ottomans began outlawing land purchases by Jews and Christians alike. And of course, the Jewish National Fund, Keren Kayemet L'Israel, is the foremost and oldest recognized agency that really got a foothold in Israel by purchasing land from the then landowners, the Ottoman Empire. Later, Zionism would become a great force against British colonialism, throwing off the shackles of imperial rule in order to establish independent statehood in 1948. So you can understand why the portrayal of Zionism as a settler colonialist movement sets my teeth on edge. First and foremost, the episode at the outset of this week's reading, in which Abraham acquires, through purchase, a burial plot in Eretz Yisrael, is intended to establish the legitimate claim of our people to this land. He pays for this territory fair and square. It passes to him and his posterity from its original owners without conditions and without contest. The Torah wants to underscore that our people had a legal and inviolable claim to this place. And this leads us to the second takeaway, which is about the Jewish psyche, observable in how Abraham introduces himself at the outset of the parasha. Ger v'toshav anochi imachem, he says, I am a stranger and sojourner, or a resident alien, among you. In one of his celebrated public lectures, the great 20th century modern Orthodox rabbi, scholar, and author Rav Joseph Ber Soloveitchik unpacked the paradox in Abraham's dual title, Ger v'toshav in Hebrew. He translates ger as stranger, but toshav he understands not merely as sojourner, but as Cantor translated, as a resident. And this is a totally valid translation. Soloveitchik himself said, Abraham's definition of his dual status, we believe, describes with profound accuracy the historical position of the Jew who resides in a predominantly non-Jewish society. He was the resident, the toshav, like other inhabitants of Canaan. He shared with them a concern for the welfare of society, digging wells and contributing to the progress of the country in loyalty to its government and its institutions. Here, Abraham was clearly a fellow citizen, a patriot among compatriots, joining others in advancing the common welfare. However, Soloveitchik goes on, there was another aspect, the spiritual, in which Abraham regarded himself as a ger, a stranger. His was a different faith, and he was governed by perceptions, truths, and observances which set him apart from the larger faith community. In this regard, Abraham and his descendants would always remain strangers. Through Rav Soloveitchik's observation, we see how our passage reveals a deeper truth about Jews and Jewish identity throughout the ages, especially now in the post-1948 era of Jewish statehood, of Jewish sovereignty, of Jewish self-determination. For the vast majority of Jewish history, we have lived at best like Abraham, dual-status Jews, part stranger, part resident. For much of our history, we could not attain citizenship in the many far-flung lands and empires in which we put down roots. In such cases, we adhered to the Talmudic dictum, Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law of the land is the law, a statement of intent that we would become law-abiding citizens wherever we found ourselves, contributing, as Soloveitchik himself observes, to the progress of the country in loyalty to its government and institutions, including, I would say, especially here in America. This is the story of your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. Following the law of the land as a matter of Jewish principle also provided us with a preemptive response to the oft-leveled anti-Semitic charge of dual loyalties. And yet, even at our law-abiding best, even in places of unparalleled opportunity and unprecedented freedom for the Jew, like right here in America, even here, we have never fully been toshav, residents as if to the place born. We've always retained some small part of our identity as the ger, the stranger, both in our self-perception and in others' perceptions of us. Given the appalling rise in anti-Semitism right here, right now, in reaction to Israel's defensive war against Hamas, many of us now suddenly feel acutely aware of that part of the Jewish condition known as ger, the stranger, the foreigner. It accounts for why so many of us feel particularly abandoned and alone at this time, and yes, betrayed. We think, how can you treat me this way when I and my parents and my grandparents and even perhaps my great-grandparents were all born in this country and have been nothing less than exemplary, loyal, patriotic, contributing citizens? Well, how indeed? In the Torah, the words ger v'toshav, resident alien, are actually written with a makaf. That's the Hebrew word for a biblical hyphen between these two words, which underscores that for the Jew, our two identities are inextricably linked. At some level, we are always strangers, even when we have resided in a place for a very long time, abiding by the law and contributing to the social welfare. We have never fully been able to shed our identity as strangers in the eyes of others, even when we no longer recognize it in ourselves. 1948 was supposed to have changed that. This, then, is the true meaning of Israel, that we would have a place where we can be toshav and no longer ger, a place to call home, a place that would change not only Jewish history but also the Jewish psyche, a home not just for the dead but for the living, for a living, thriving Jew, for the living, thriving Jewish people. This is to say, 1948 severed the hyphen between ger and toshav and allowed us, at last, to live out the destiny to which Abraham only alluded in his introduction to the Hittites, the destiny to which God had called him and his family, Lihiot am chofshi be'artzenu, Eretz Tzion v'Yerushalayim, to be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. Shabbat Shalom.